So one of the things you might be wondering is who is Jonathon Wilson-Hartgrove? And if you haven't read his books, by the way, you can find his author page on Amazon.com. If you looked at the ad for this conversation, you saw 4 of his many books. So he's definitely an author. You saw Wisdom of Stability. You also saw Strangers at My Door. And you should have also seen Reconstructing the Gospel and his latest book, which was Revolution of Values. They are all worth reading. Let me read you a little bit of what one reviewer says about Jonathon. Not only is he the leader of a new monastic movement and co-founder of the Rutba House community, Jonathon speaks out like the prophets of old and calls us into a lifestyle of virtue. The kind of virtue that invites us to cultivate stability, to see ourselves deliberately. And Kathleen Norris, who is the author of The Quotidian Mysteries, says this about Jonathon. This author gives us a way of understanding why in an era of exponential change, the social and political implications of our life are directly connected to our ability to love well. To love well in ways that allow us to maintain relationships of trust, respect, and keep us in the struggle with a steady hand. This is part of our worship series, Uncommon Love for the Common Good. And I can't think of a more interesting person to help us anchor ourselves in uncommon love than Jonathon Wilson-Hartgrove. So if you got a chance to actually give a wave of hands to say applause, which is what we would do if we were in a room together. Jonathon, welcome. Good morning. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you. It's a joy to be with you all this morning.
Jonathon, can we start a little bit talking a little bit about your journey? I know you've been writing almost all your life. You've been, you write because you are a reader and because you have a lot to say, but we've described you as an author and an activist. How do you describe yourself when you think about who Jonathon Wilson-Hartgrove is?
Well, I'm a kid of North Carolina's tobacco country who got caught up in the Jesus movement early on, and I haven't been able to get untangled from it yet. I think that's who I am, and it's been a journey with Jesus and with Jesus's people that has shaped me. And I've wrestled with all of the ways in which my own faith, our faith that we share, has been manipulated and compromised in this culture. That's very evident before us, certainly in the aftermath of an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol just a week before last. That people were waving Christian flags while they were trying to overthrow the government. So I've spent my life wrestling with that, but also wrestling with the way that Jesus and the movement that Jesus started offers us a real alternative to the machinations of this world that have us in such a mess. And so I'm staying with Jesus and with those folks who are following Jesus, especially from the margins, toward liberation and freedom, justice for all people. So that's who I am right here in North Carolina. I'm about 90 miles from where I grew up now in the Walltown neighborhood of Durham. And I've learned a great deal from my sisters and brothers in this community. I certainly attribute to my neighbors and to the spirituality that was born on the edge of the plantation down the road from here about 2 centuries ago. I attribute my being able to stick with Jesus to the faithfulness of those folks who heard a liberating word in the brush arbors. So that's me.
It's interesting that you bring up the idea of being about 90 miles from where you grew up. In your book, Wisdom, The Wisdom of Stability, you talk a lot about having lived all over the world. And do you mind if I just read a passage from that book?
Oh, please. I always appreciate being reminded of what I've said.
Well, um, you start off talking about the fact that your mother. You say, my mother is the eldest daughter of a mendicant musician, and she moved 28 times before she started high school.
Mhm.
But she settled down into this land and learned to appreciate the beauty of it. I love the idea that the stability we're made for helps us establish roots of love. We learn the attention that is needed to really grow in and as we come to know a community. I've lived all over the world, and in doing so, I've discovered that part of my life is to experience the need for foundations that allows me to have stability. Tell us a little bit about where you've lived and what you've done before
Well,
you
I
came
guess
back
I
to
should
Europe.
confess that as a teenager, felt quite restless in the place where I was raised. I think that partly had to do with recognizing um, that I was living in a place that was in the midst of an identity crisis. Um, I've learned more about this since that time, but the most recent book I wrote, it's called Revolution of Values, is really a book about the campaign that targeted communities like the one where I grew up all of my life, really. It basically began right before I was born and has been all about trying to uh, target what we often refer to in our common life here in the United States as, red counties, but to target religious people in those places and cultivate a culture that normalizes the sort of um, uh, conservative politics that people wanted to advance in order to maintain power for themselves. And I was in the midst of that, a restless young person who wanted to get out and see what else was happening in the world. So initially, I very much a product of that culture, wanted to become a politician. So I went to Washington, D.C., and I worked in the U.S. Senate for Senator Strom Thurmond. That kind of disillusioned me pretty quickly with the way in which my faith had been connected with right-wing politics, because I could see the basic contradictions of that, even though I didn't know in full what an alternative would be. So I spent a bit of time wandering the world with missions organizations of the church. I was in Africa and South America and other places. And then also in my own education, I learned, poor kid from rural North Carolina has to learn how to work the systems that exist. And I learned that the federal government funds certain kinds of travel. So I was a young ambassador for the United States of America and studied in Europe um, while I was doing that. So that's been a bit of my journey. Eventually, though, it landed me back in the United States, spending time as I finished my education on the streets of Philadelphia and with people who had become homeless there. I quickly got to know that many of them were veterans of the Vietnam War. And I was in that context of relationship with people who were marginalized when 9/11 happened and when I began with my wife Leah and the community around us at that time to discern, what does it mean to live faithfully as a Christian, and at that moment when Christianity was being used to wage a war against the Muslim world. And so that got me involved with the Christian peacemaker teams and with a Christian peace witness in Iraq that has certainly shaped the rest of my life. I live here at a place called Rutba House because we were in Rutba, Iraq, when the United States was bombing um, in 2003. And though our country bombed the hospital in Rutba, one of the doctors from that hospital saved our friends who were severely injured in a car accident. And we asked him what we owed him for his services, and he said, "You don't owe me anything. Please just tell people what's really happening here." And so we came back to the US in 2003 telling that story, of people who were supposed to be our enemies, picking our friends up out of the ditch and saving their lives. And, as a kid raised on the Bible, I knew that was the Good Samaritan story. And when Jesus says, "Go and do likewise" at the end of that story, we felt like that was a word directly to us. So we started the Rutba House here in Walltown as a house of hospitality in response to that hospitality that we had received in Rutba, Iraq. And this is where we've been since 2003. So that's my personal history in a nutshell.
And you talk about the fact that the house itself is an old house with some steady foundations, but also a few cracks. And it sounds
well, when we moved to the neighborhood, well, I'm actually in a different house right now than I lived in when I wrote that book. But when we moved to the neighborhood, the only place in the neighborhood, so this is a historically Black neighborhood on the edge of Duke University. Now, Duke University, and folks who only know the Blue Devils and the basketball team might not know that in a neighborhood like this, folks refer to the university still to this day as the plantation. So there's a long history of neighborhoods that were used for service work, mostly Black folks over the years, increasingly Latino folks here over the last couple decades. But at any rate, we moved to this neighborhood, and the only house that was big enough to really be a hospitality house where we would have rooms to invite people into was this old house that sat up on the hill, and we were able to rent it. And I started talking to the neighbors, and I knew it had been built in 1910, which was really right at the beginning of this neighborhood. And most of the houses in this neighborhood were shotgun houses. Y'all know the Southern history of shotgun houses, one room lined up in front of another room, in front of another room, so that you could open all the doors and shoot a shotgun through it. That's shotgun houses in the South. And, poor people across the South lived in houses like that through most of the 20th century. So most of the houses here were shotgun houses, but there was this big house on the hill. And I said to my neighbor, George, "George, who in the world built this house in 1910? And he said, "Oh, it was that Irishman married to an Indian woman." That's how he said it. And I said, "What do you mean? This was a African-American neighborhood, and an Irishman and a Native American woman lived here in 1910. And that was a education to me that in the Jim Crow South, someone like an Irishman in 1910 and a Native American woman were both considered Black. And this was the only place they could live in 1910. So anyway, they had a big house on the hill, and it had gotten purchased and passed through families and was sort of in disrepair. But we lived in it for about a decade, and paying attention to those cracks in the wall was an education to me about the importance of a foundation. It was also when the floor began to open up and there were spaces large enough that our smallest children could fall through them. It was an instruction to us that we needed to find somewhere else.
The most fascinating thing about the way you wove in the story of the house with the story of the values, particularly the values of the church, the values of Christianity, it is fascinating. And one of the things that you talk about is how much our life is rooted in the love of God and the foundation of the love of God, but that it's our response to that love and how we live it out in community that makes the difference. That part of what was called new monasticism was really significant for you. I'm thinking. Talk to us a little bit about that idea of rooted community and new monasticism and how it shaped what was your also a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when we began trying to live our life in a hospitality house and in this neighborhood, learning from our neighbors about how they lived the gospel in this place, and with an awareness that the gospel had become so distorted, kind of Christian nationalism and
Mhm.
evangelical patriotism that had celebrated the war in Iraq and had blamed so many poor people for the situation that they found themselves in, and had in many ways pitted us against the values of Jesus.
Mm.
uh, Part of what we recognize is that we needed a place to be formed, right? We had been malformed. We
Mm.
needed like when you realize that you're getting a little overweight, you go to the gym and you say, I need a physical trainer. I need somebody who can take a look at my life and tell me how I can live my life in such a way that I can get in better shape. Or, sometimes when we're aware of our own mental health needs, we go to a counselor and say, I need a program to work to address the way that my mental health has gotten out of shape. Well, in the same way, I think we kind of early in our life looked at ourselves and realized we have a faith life that's all out of shape, and it's formed us to love Jesus and to want to follow Jesus, but in many ways to not be well equipped to do that. And well, like you said earlier, we were in seminary back then. And as I went to seminary, in part because I was still trying to figure all this stuff out, and it seemed like a way that I could take some time to learn from the tradition. And as I dug into the history of the church in particular, I realized that there was this pattern of monastic movements that arose at precisely those moments in our history when faith became compromised because it was allied with the dominant power in the particular culture. So it's after Constantine, embraces the faith of his mother and then begins to create a kind of Christendom, that you have some people go out into the deserts of Syria and Egypt and begin to form a monastic way of life that offers an opportunity for formation in faith outside of that imperial Christianity. It's in the Middle Ages when the sort of early phases of capitalism are beginning to be born, and there's a kind of an international market that's developing, that the son of a cloth merchant hears the word from the Lord that says, rebuild my church, which is in ruins. And he establishes a mendicant movement that, the Poor Clares and the Franciscans begin to sort of cultivate a new kind of monastic movement to discern how you could be Christian in the midst of a culture that's so captive to money. It's there's cycles like that. And it felt to us like we were at that kind of point that the Desert Mothers and Fathers found themselves at, that St. Benedict found himself at, that Francis and Clare found themselves at, a kind of point where you were raised as a Christian, but the Christian formation that you've received hasn't quite prepared you to follow Jesus in the context that you're now facing. And so what do you do in the midst of that? We say, well, we don't know exactly what it should look like, but we want to experiment with a new monasticism, with a new way of living out our faith in community and developing practices that can help us discern what God wants us to be. So we weren't alone in that. There were lots of young people, particularly young evangelicals, who were disillusioned by the alignment of white evangelicalism in America with this so-called war on terror. I'm still confused. It has never ended, and I don't suppose it ever can. Once you declare a war on terror that terrorizes people all over the world, how does terror ever end? I didn't know what it meant when they first said it, and I still don't know exactly what a war on terror could mean. It seems like almost by definition a war without end. And so we were caught up in that with many people. And this attempt to root ourselves in a place, to learn from people who had been marginalized and who had faced injustice in those places, and learn from them and with them how to follow Jesus in those places. That was very much the impetus for the kind of new monasticism that we felt drawn to in the early 2000s. So yeah, I've spent a good bit of my life trying to discern that together with other people.
You know, it's really interesting that you would bring up this question of being shaped or formed and malformed. William Winter, who was the governor of Mississippi, and I think, in my opinion, the last great statesman we've had in Mississippi, died recently. And one
Mm-hmm.
of the things I remember Governor Winter talking about on a couple of occasions was how his life in in his early community and in the church shaped him to think of religion and to think of Christianity in a particular way that allowed him to interact with people of color, especially Black people, um, in a way that was, his words were that, you know, they were half human. And I remember him saying that, you know, we were good people. My family was good people. We treated people well, but it wasn't until I went to World War II and fought along Black soldiers that I realized I was dealing with people who were human beings in the same way that I was a human being.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that when we look at your book, Reconstructing the Gospel, that is part of what you were trying, the message that you were trying to work with around freeing this country from those kinds of tropes. William Winter talked about it for him, that he experienced a second conversion, and it inspired him in Mississippi to really begin to use politics and government to try and change life for all the citizens of Mississippi. And when I think about how you write so well, your book, again, Reconstructing the Gospel, you talk about that slaveholder religion and how it has captivated and maybe held us captive. I wonder, Jonathon, when you see where we are now and what happened in the last week, how do you look at that through the lens of your book and your writing, Reconstructing the Gospel?
Well, like Brother Winter, I was raised in a Christianity that assumed white supremacy. That's what I mean when I say slaveholder religion, a religion that has accommodated itself to white supremacy. And I think it's incredibly important, particularly for the folks who are not from the South, to recognize that white supremacy never thinks of itself as hateful, right? White supremacy imagines itself, particularly the Christian forms of white supremacy, have always imagined themselves to be benevolent. So the opposite of what I'm trying to say is that white power, white supremacy, is not primarily about hate. It's about the power. And the kind of hate that we saw last week, that certainly, you know, associated with right-wing white supremacist groups that were there at the Capitol and that have been enraged, in particular by the president who they saw as their champion losing the election last fall. That is a reaction against a threat to their power. But people who have had that power, and in particular who have accommodated their religion to that power, genuinely believe and have told themselves and their children and their children's children that it's for the good of everybody that they maintain that power. So what we're dealing with is the way in which the gospel interrupts our religion's capitulation to the power dynamics of the world in which we live. And that, of course, is what Frederick Douglass saw in the 19th century when he called it slaveholder religion. He said, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I see the widest possible difference. Why is that? Because he had been born into a family that the white folks claimed to own. And the same people who claimed to own his family also claimed to be Christian and to be teaching them what Christianity meant. But when he got away from that and got to the North, he joined the AME Church. And he heard a gospel that was about something very different. So that's certainly true. But that's always the case of the gospel, right? It's always the case of God's truth. You go all the way back to the Old Testament prophets, and they say, the problem is not just, take Ezekiel, for example, chapter 22. The problem is not just these rulers who, Ezekiel uses the image of a ravenous wolf, says they devour their people with their unjust policies, but it's also the priests and the prophets who whitewash their deeds, right? There's always a religion that justifies and props up the people in power, the sort of, court prophets that Herod calls in to consult when the Magi show up, and who are accomplices in his murderous acts that take place down in Bethlehem. So that is the case in every era. And in our own context, when we pay attention to the history we've inherited, to the world in which we live, we still have a slaveholder religion that was cultivated right alongside the practice of race-based chattel slavery that, that is our American invention. We created that as an identity, as a way to identify people, and then created a society that was built on using and abusing bodies and the labor of people who were raced differently than the so-called white people. That created a false identity for those who were enslaved, but it also created a false identity for those people who were told that they were white, right? So now what we've got to grapple with in our current context, this is what Brother James Baldwin made so clear at the end of his life. Not only do we have to grapple with the injustices that have been done to people who are race Black, but also what has this done to the humanity of people who were told that they were white? And Baldwin used to ask this question: what were you before you were white? Because America made you white. What were you before that? What were your people before they were white? And what did you lose in the process of adopting this artificial identity that tells you that you're better than some people because of the color of your skin? I think that is a fundamental discipleship question for Christians in America. And I think we are in the midst of a great social crisis, great identity crisis in this country that is going to force the church to grapple with that. We've, over the last 4 decades, if you're a religionist like me and you pay attention to these things, I know most people aren't, but we get surveys, and we, for 4 decades, Pew numbers, Pew's the group that does these surveys, the Pew numbers have shown that the number of people who, when asked what their religious affiliation is, they say none. The pollsters call these people the nuns. They say the nuns are the fastest growing religious group in the country, but this is not good news for the convents, because they're not saying N-U-N-S, they're saying N-O-N-E-S, those nuns, the people who say they have no religious affiliation. That's been the fastest growing group. And over these past 4 decades, that number has doubled every decade for 4 decades. Why? You talk to those people and ask them, why has your church shrunk over the last 4 decades? Why has the congregation I'm part of shrunk over the last 4 decades? Why have so many? We ask the children and the grandchildren of the people who've been in those congregations, and what they'll tell you is that they are uncomfortable being associated with what Christianity has come to mean in American public life. Many times, and I talk to counsel, walk with many of these people, that people don't say they're no longer interested in Jesus. They don't say they're no longer interested in the, fundamental questions that churches and other religious communities deal with. What's the true purpose of my life? How do I want to raise my children? What happens to me and my loved ones when we die? What does it mean to make a lifelong commitment to a partner and to figure out how to negotiate that? These are the sort of things that churches and other religious communities have always talked about. And these people, who the pollsters call nuns, have all the same questions. They're dealing with the same stuff. They're forming various kinds of community and other places to process those things. So it's not that those people don't care about these. It's not that we've entered some sort of irreligious era. No, they don't want to be associated with what their friends understand when they hear the word Christian. And why is that? Because that idea of what it means to be Christian has been so shaped by the Franklin Grahams and the Jerry Falwells and the Paula Whites and the right-wing extremists who, in the name of Jesus, have done all sorts of not just politically nefarious things, but also, obviously crass attempts to make money and to build up themselves, that people have said, I don't want anything to do with that. So that's the identity crisis that we're facing. And I think it's forcing us to be a lot more honest about what's really going on. So in that way, I think we're living in a very exciting time. It's a very exciting time to follow Jesus. When it's not just saying you're a Christian isn't going to help you be an upstanding member of the local social club. So maybe we can get down to what it's really about.
Jonathon, in hearing you and thinking about our sermon and this worship series, Uncommon Love, it sounds as if you're saying that part of the work of the church at the moment is to reclaim love in a way that is meaningful and in a way that speaks to people who are still hungry for the love of God, but who are hearing or perhaps not experiencing it from the church. Am I reading you wrong?
My experience is that we've got to relearn love. It certainly needs to be reclaimed. Our faith needs to be reclaimed from those who so abused it. But I think we have to begin by acknowledging how tied up we all are with the compromises and the capitulations that have led us to this place. I don't want to be part of it. In a context right now where we have such obviously extreme versions of abused faith, I don't want to be part of some sort of self-righteous crowd that stands over here and says, "Oh, that is not us." Well, most of us have not stormed the Capitol to try to overthrow an election, but let's be honest. A lot of us have gone along with narratives and a kind of capitulation to the world as it is, where we have not challenged less extreme versions of the same sort of lies that motivated those people to do what they did. And I was telling somebody yesterday, look, if you believe the lie and you're a sincere person, it's not irrational to do what they did. I mean, if you really believe that an election was stolen and that a new regime is going to illegitimately come in and take over the government, and as they believe, if you really believe that that's going to make it fundamentally impossible for you to live the life that you've lived, people are not crazy. They're acting rationally based on lies. And a lot of us have gone along with the lies. Maybe not the lie that the election was stolen, but how about the lie that has been prevalent and widespread in the church for over a century? The lie that says, if you're poor, you probably deserve to be poor.
Mm,
Often want to say it that clearly, but
mhm,
even our most liberal churches go along with these financial literacy programs where we give out of our abundance to say that if you jump through this series of hoops and show us that you know how to manage your money in a capitalist society, then we might bless you with a little bit of our opportunity. Poor people, in my experience, poor people know how to handle money a lot better than the middle class people that I've been around. Do you know how much money middle class people waste on trash? I mean, just junk, plastic wrapped junk that we give each other for birthdays. I know if my neighbor up the street that has raised, 6 children and 2 dozen grandchildren, cleaning people's houses, everybody who didn't have a place to stay, either when they came home from jail or when they lost a job, staying up in her house. If she managed the budget of this state or of this nation, we'd be just fine. Poor people know how to handle money. What poor people haven't had is access to money.
mm,
And we've gone along with all sorts of lies that have said that's acceptable, that's normal. I'm talking about the neoliberal lies that say, we have an economy that's basically working for everybody, but some people fall through the cracks, or they have some sort of personal issue they need to deal with, and so we're going to lift them up and let them be as good as us. No, that's a lie too. We
mm.
go along with these lies.
Your revolution, so the revolution of values that you're talking about pushes us as the church to go beyond a kind of two-stage thinking to an intersectional way of thinking that says the wisdom from the margins, and feel free to tell me if I'm wrong, the wisdom of the margins is the wisdom that will help us actually reclaim the message and the love of Jesus and the work of the church. Is that
That's right. That's where I've learned this love, this uncommon love we're talking about. We learn it from the people who've learned how to love, who've been loved by God,
Mhm,
precisely in those places where they've been marginalized and pushed aside. I opened the book with a story about my dear sister Julia from right there
you
in
did.
the Twin Cities.
Mhm. Julia
A beautiful
Dinsmore.
sister who's taught me so much. If you've never read her poem, My Name Is Not Those People,
Mhm,
find it, and you can put it into YouTube, and Danny Glover reads it on one version of it. But this is a poor woman from your city who wanted to organize other women in the 70s and 80s uh, uh, to find housing for themselves, and they raised their own money and just needed a financial sponsor, to receive the grants so that they could build the houses. And when
mhm,
they took it to a church committee, I won't name the church because it's right there in your town, but when they took it when they took it to the church committee, the chair of the committee said, uh, don't we give those people turkeys every Christmas and Thanksgiving? Why do we need to become their financial sponsor?
mhm,
And so she wrote this poem, My Name Is Not Those People.
mhm,
It's a beautiful poem, but it's an expression, I think, in many ways, of the wisdom and the love that someone like her embodies, and that I think she has offered to her community. A love that says, I'm not going to believe the lies that have been told about me, but I'm also not going to believe the lies that have been told about you. I'm going to work for a beloved community, for a common humanity. That's what that's what this Dr. King weekend really has to be about.
mhm,
We diminish Dr. King when we act like he was just some sort of person who came along and helped white people realize that we could live without the Jim Crow signs. No, that's not what Dr. King was doing. Dr. King wasn't saying, that we just need a meritocracy where everybody can be recognized, based on the content of their character, some sort of colorblind society where, we can all get along. No, what Dr. King was saying is that there is systemic injustice. At the end of his life, he was saying that it's always based on race, it's based on poverty, and it's based on militarism. These are systems that have excluded people and that have made life incredibly difficult for some people, while it's propped some other people up with the sort of what the Christian tradition can only call pride, the sort of pride that says we deserve to be the custodians of this great society, the wealthiest country to ever exist in the world. And Dr. King said, no, we've got to address the inequality in this system, and we've got to build a beloved community where the dignity and humanity of every person means that we refuse to accept inequality. Yes, people are different. Yes, there's a diversity of gifts. Yes, people can live different kinds of life. But if everybody doesn't have the basic things you need to survive, then we are failing as a society. That's what Dr. King was saying, and that's why they killed him. So in many ways, that's I think what we have to focus ourselves on in terms of the revolution of values that Dr. King called for. How do we abandon these thin definitions of love and of righteousness and of mercy that have accommodated the degree of inequality that we see in our society? How do we leave those things behind, repent of them, and disciple ourselves to the love of Jesus, the love that says that the people who are marginalized are going to lead the revolution. They're going to lead us into a new reality. That's what we see in the gospel. Jesus gets together this ragtag bunch of people who, would never be together if it wasn't for Jesus. You got Simon the Zealot right there alongside Matthew the tax collector. Now, let's just translate that into our current context. You got somebody who's a government employee on the team with somebody who's on the federal watch list, right? These are not people who are supposed to be together. And Jesus brings people together like this and says, to those who are hungry, to those who are thirsty, to those who've been marginalized, to those who've suffered injustice, to those who've been caught up in the mess, you're going to lead us. You're going to lead us into the kingdom of God, the new order that isn't going to make the world perfect here and now, but that does push us toward greater equality and prepare us for that day, that great day that Amos prophesied, where justice can roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That's I think that's the work that we're called to, and that's what I'm stirred to be part of as I remember Dr. King.
Jonathon, I hope everyone else is as buzzed as I am. I want to go directly to where we are. Again, you're right. We're here in Minneapolis. We're a downtown congregation, historically moving toward work with ministry with those who are on the margins and on the poor. But we feel again really that we're at an inflection point. And so I wonder, what do you say to a congregation like Hennepin? We're not a new church development. The footprint here is large and old, and yet there is a desire to not just be relevant, but a desire to be a prophetic community and to really truly be authentic. What are three things that you might say to us that would give us the courage or that would convict us and push us toward the kind of revolution that you're talking about?
Well, when you're a big old ship, I always say to churches, acknowledge that you're a big old ship. Don't pretend you're something else. And if you know anything about ships, you know that a big ship can be turned with a little bit of shift in the rudder, right? It doesn't take changing everything at once. You shift the direction and give it a little time, and a big ship can go in a whole different direction. So to that degree, I think it's all about what is setting your direction. And the word I would offer from sort of meditations that we've been having here this morning is that listening closely to the voices of those who have been marginalized right there in the community and asking what they are saying is God's word for us in this moment. I often think about this, in churches. I've spent a lot of time with churches in my adult life where people say, we just want to discern. We just want to hear what the Lord is saying to us. We're going to have a retreat. We're going to have a time of fasting and prayer. We're going to have a committee. We're going to have a strategic planning consultant. There's various ways to go about this, but it's a genuine concern that churches have. And I often think about how, if you look at Scripture, God is pretty clear about how God hears what the priorities should be for a community. Look at the Exodus. I have heard the voice of my people crying. That's what God says to Moses, right? Moses didn't even want to hear from God. Moses was out there with the sheep and the bush caught on fire and he couldn't avoid it. But so Moses, he was certainly no part of no committee process to hear the voice of God, but God interrupts him and demands to be heard and, has him take off his feet and be on holy ground. And what God says to Moses, I think is something we should all pay attention to. He says, look, I've heard the voice of people crying. You should go and help them do what they're crying out for. And so many times I think if that's how God listens, maybe our discernment doesn't have to be so complicated. Because in every place I've visited in this country, the people who are suffering injustice are crying out. If God hears them, we probably can too if we listen. And if we're listening, we could go and join them. Martin Luther King weekend, the Fight for 15 is holding strike and protests at fast food restaurants all over this country. Literally, if you're like driving through your town and you see a bunch of people outside the McDonald's, they're crying out for a living wage and a union. That's what they're saying. Some years ago, I got involved with the Fight for 15, and they said, we're a movement that believes that the church has a moral voice in society, and we want the church to be involved. I said, okay, let me know what you want me to do. So they said, we're doing one of these strikes, and I showed up at the first one. Fast food workers get up early because everybody wants their sausage biscuit before they go to work. So they were striking at 6 a.m. So I could get over there, and I said, what y'all need me to do? They said, nothing, just listen. So I stood outside the McDonald's for an hour and I listened to people talking about what it's like to try to live on a fast food worker's salary, how they work at the McDonald's for a shift and then they go across the street and work at the Bojangles for a shift. And then, some of them have a night job a few nights a week so they can get in another shift or two and still can't make ends meet. And, I thought, well, I ought to do something, but they just said, listen. And I kept listening. And lo and behold, we were about an hour into it, and they called this young woman to testify. And I said, oh, I haven't seen her in a few years. She grew up in our church. So this sister who was raised in our church came with grandma, while she was a little girl. Now she's a young woman trying to make it on her own, working these fast food wages, don't have time or desire or whatever to show up at church. But here she is out on the picket line on the strike day, telling her story about how she can't survive on the wages that she's making. I said to myself, good Lord, I mean, this is just this movement is trying to help me be a basic pastor. Like, just listen to the people who literally grew up in my congregation and who I haven't seen in years talk about what's really impacting their lives. She was out on the street corner testifying, and I needed a movement to help me just hear her basic pastoral need. So all that to say, I think the first thing is to hear the cries of those who are hurting in your community. And that doesn't have to be complicated, because these people are literally screaming, whether it's I can't breathe, or I can't survive on 725, or the young climate activists who are saying, look, we know enough to know that the earth is literally crying out. Our native sisters and brothers, like my brother Winsor Nosey down in Oak Flat, literally right here at the end of this Trump administration. It's been in the news a little bit that they're accelerating executions. It's been in the news a little bit that they are signing over land in the Arctic for oil exploration. They're also, this hasn't gotten as much coverage, they're also trying to take the holiest place from the Apache people and hand it over to a copper mine before Trump leaves office next week. And here, here our brother is crying out and saying, to my Christian sisters and brothers, this seems like a religious freedom issue. You're always saying so much about how religious freedom is so important to the democracy that you established on this land that you stole from our people. Well, if you believe in religious freedom, could you please send some of your people out here to say that we Christians who believe in religious freedom also believe our Apache sisters and brothers should be able to have the holy spring where every young woman's coming of age ceremony must take place with the waters from which the Creator made us. Could you please say that that spring should belong to our people and should not be consumed by a copper mine so that a multinational corporation can make money? These cries are out there. So I know you were asking for a short list of things, but that would be the first thing. The first thing that can turn the rudder is when a community, a church decides we're going to listen to the cries that are coming from the people. The second thing would be do what they ask you to do. They're often pretty straightforward demands. And the third thing I would say to churches in particular is use the power that you have as a community called together in God's name to bless what is happening that you didn't start. Let me say that again.
That sounds powerful. Say that one again.
Use the power you have as a community called together in God's name to bless what's happening that you didn't start. I'll tell you a quick story. My friend, Michael Mather, pastors a Methodist church down in Indiana. Mm-hmm. And Mike has told me about years ago how he met a fellow who's a mutual friend of ours who was from the neighborhood. Diamon's his name. And Diamond knew the neighborhood, knew it well, used to stop by the church. And it said, Mike said that the Spirit just prompted him one day to say, Diamond, you are a listener in this neighborhood. You listen to the people. And we really need that as a church. Would you let this church hire you to be the roving listener in our community? And Diamond said, well, what would my job description be? He said, you do what you already do, but you'd come to our staff meeting every week and you would tell us the stories of what's happening in our community and help us make the connection between the gospel that we're preaching and worshiping around, and what God is doing in the community. And so Diamond took on that role, and it's shaped the congregation in many ways. Mike wrote it up as a story called "Having Nothing, Possessing Everything." You can read it; it's a book. But the part of it that I love the most and have appreciated in visiting them is that, again, this is a big old ship, Methodist Church on the north side of Indianapolis. Um, they reimagined their worship liturgy around this call, and they decided that the end of every service, after they had the reading of the gospel, after they had the preaching of the gospel, after they celebrated communion, the end of their liturgy had to be the gospel for us today. And so each week they pick one story, one person, one group in the neighborhood that, Diamond, or they have many other roving listeners now, but people who have heard in the neighborhood something that's happening in the neighborhood that they know the Spirit of God is part of and is blessed. And they invite that person to come into the church and tell the congregation what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then they borrowed from the wedding liturgy, and they said, if after the person tells the story, the pastor stands up and says, if those of you who are gathered here today will pledge, with your time and talent and resources to support what, God is doing through this neighbor of ours, would you please stand up and say, we will? And so they end every service by blessing the whole group, hundreds of people there to worship. Stands up and blesses, the sister who's baking cakes out of her house, or the woman that started an after school program just for the neighbors, because she realized that their parents, weren't around when they got home from school, and she wanted them to get their homework done, or whoever it is, whatever's happening, they identify it and they bless it. And when I first saw that, I thought, that's what a church can do. A church calls people together in God's name to remember the story. The least we can do is say to the people in our place, we see God's story continuing in you. Be blessed.
Jonathon, we've got about not quite half an hour, and I really want to make sure that we have an opportunity for everyone who's here perhaps to have a chance to ask a question and interact. So I want to close our conversation by asking you, where are you hopeful? In reading, I hear the strong message that says, again, there is a need for change. There is a need for the church to relearn how to love and to reclaim the gospel, and then to proclaim it in a particular way. But I also hear that it sounds like you are hopeful in spite of these really critical times in which we live.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I feel like my brother, who was the bishop of the Episcopal Church in North Carolina a few years ago, he became the bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States. And then he got famous because he preached the royal wedding, over there. But I remember when they first ordained him to be bishop, they asked him if he was hopeful about the future of the Episcopal Church. I remember what he said. He said, I don't know much about the future of the Episcopal Church, but I believe in the God movement. and I'm hopeful that the Jesus movement will continue on, whatever form it takes. I kind of feel like him. There's a lot of churches that are so caught up in our way of being things and being in control. I don't know whether we're going to make it through. We're going to argue and fight over property and fight over rules and who's in and who's out. And who knows what all's going to come of that. Our institutions may have to die, some of them. But I believe in this movement of the love of God, the love that moves the sun and other stars, Dante said, coming to us in flesh, in a human being, not being very well accepted by the institutions of his own day, but going to those who were marginalized, who were pushed to the edges, telling them God loves you, and God has made it possible not only for you to be blessed and to have eternal life, the kind and quality of life that goes on forever, but also for you to share that with the world. That movement hasn't died and it's not going to die. And I just want to be part of it. So I'm hopeful in the Jesus movement.
I think that we are small enough so that we could actually ask questions verbally.
Oh,
And
please do.
so
I'd love to know who you are and where
let's
you're coming
open
from.
let's open a little bit. We've got 25 minutes. We're going to honor your time today. And so if you would do this, if you would just say your first name, and then if you have a question for Jonathon, go ahead and ask your question. And I can see all of you. So if you want to raise your hand and let me know that you're coming, we'll do it that way. Peter, let me ask, are there any questions in the chat?
Nothing that I've seen.
Okay.
And I would just want to say that you all have the ability to unmute yourself. If you have questions or if you have problems, just wave and I can click the button that'll give you a request to unmute yourself.
Great. So let's have a little conversation. Judy Tucker.
We, excuse me, my husband and I were actually on the phone last night with somebody else from the church, talking about an issue with a sort of a mission, a ministry that we're involved with. And what you're talking about is just really kind of striking at the heart of it. So I don't know if any of them will want to join in, but when you're in the, and I will just say that I have just retired from 20 years working for HUD, the Federal Housing Agency, and I've had a lot of experience working through other organizations and sometimes directly with poor people. And we're an affluent congregation. So I guess what I struggle with is how do you how do you work with people that are marginalized across some of the sort of barriers that we have, like in the particular situation we were struggling with last night about was language. We have people that speak Swahili and we don't have any facility with Swahili. How do, we've been trying to empower this family that we're involved with, but it's just so messy. And I know from my years working at HUD that you have to expect things to be messy, and there are a lot of structures that make things messy, but we're just kind of in a place of with a particular situation of not even, I don't even know how to think about what I'm trying to do. I don't know if this is so vague that you can't even address it, but I'm thinking that you probably have some word of wisdom.
Oh, I know messy.
And you're wondering, are we doing good? Or are we doing bad?
Well, here's a few things I've learned to think about. Things are going to be messy because we're dealing with people. So I expect the mess, but I want to be especially conscious of the way my own formation and the way white supremacy in this country has shaped me and communities like yours to be people who perpetuate the structures as they exist, right? So in a context where we're dealing with real need, people in real need, I always want to address the need while also acknowledging that there are ways that we can always get caught up in sort of managing the poverty industry. Let's just be real. There's a lot of money that's been spent on managing poverty. And if you talk to poor people will tell you that they're very aware of the way that most of those systems keep them poor. So as a church, called into those spaces, part of what I'm saying about listening to the cries of people who are hurting is that I think we always need to be attentive to what people want. And that has been, in my experience, much more an organizing question than a question of charity, right? Charity is often the question of those who have something asking, how can we help? Which is a way of saying, what do we want to give? And I'm not saying that's a bad impulse, but I'm saying that's a different question than people who are hurting and suffering asking, what do we want to be different? And I often encourage the church and particular congregations to get more engaged in the organizing side of communities asking what they want and what they want to be different, and to be in conversation, be in conscious conversation about how that changes our consensus as a congregation, as a group, about what we can give, what we want to give, and how we want to give in the communities that we're part of. I hope that addresses what you're saying, because I know you're not.
Well, I mean, just to follow up, we're
particular details, but
specifically
I've been,
talking, in this case, we're specifically talking about charity, not organizing.
Mhm.
And it is a question of it's a question sort of what we want to give, but also what's helpful. And it's very specific and individual.
Mhm.
But I think that a lot of the sort of language that I'm used to does come from more the organizing side, it's helpful to have that distinction. I still don't, it's difficult to know what specifically to do. Anyway, thank you.
There's
Well,
one
it often
question.
is.
There's one question here in the chat, and it's from a person who's joined us from Georgia. I've been asked a ton of questions around the intersection of our corporate value of life, abortion and holistically, justice and Christian values. How should we speak about this with those who range from conservative to liberal? And how can this be a discussion of truth as opposed to a vitriolic fight of ideas? Wow. I'm glad I'm not you, Jonathan. It's big.
Well, I think we can always talk about the things that Jesus thought were important. When I talk to Christians, I don't like to get into too much of the debate that has obviously been established, like the very terms of the debate have been established to try to preserve the present order of things. I'm more interested in talking about what Jesus thought was important. I mean, just ask, what did Jesus do? Jesus spent most of his public ministry establishing free healthcare clinics for the most desperately marginalized people of his day. I mean, to be frank, that's what a healing ministry is. Now, you can argue about policy and the best way to get there, but it would be difficult to argue from Jesus's actual practice that Jesus would not be in favor of everyone having health care. Jesus seemed especially concerned about poor people not only getting the basic things that they needed, like something to eat, housing, but also being recognized in their full dignity. So blessed are the poor, the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. If the kingdom of heaven belongs to them, it seems like, some basic access to the society they live in probably should belong to them too. So those are the kinds of things that that I would talk to people who consider themselves conservative or liberal or whatever if you're going to talk about Christianity, it seems like you can talk about Jesus and what Jesus's priorities were. And, even to the extent that, somebody wants to say that they're pro-life and that's what shapes their politics. I mean, I know the long history of how that's been used to try to recruit people into the Republican Party. But, even at the present state of things, it's hard to say why someone who you would call a pro-life president has spent the last days of his administration making sure people get executed.
Yeah, exactly.
Or why someone who calls themselves pro-life wouldn't want everyone to have health care, or wouldn't want families who have parents or partners who work full-time or more not earn enough to actually take care of the lives that they're responsible for. Those seem to me to be pro-life things too. So even within the terms of the debate, which I don't fully accept, but even within the terms, I think we can have a conversation.
Mark?
Hello, Mark.
Hey, thanks for speaking.
It's good to be with you.
Before COVID hit, my wife Judy and I and some others here were on a committee to do something with the opportunity to create a new service within the big ship of Hennepin.
Okay.
And
A new worship service.
a new worship service.
Uh-huh.
And the way I understood it, it was sort of like it was a chance to renew the energy of the congregation. And so I'm going to have two questions. I noticed that there was one poll was to fire up the existing people, and the other was to attract more people. And related to sort of with both of those, in my mind, was a balance between changing hearts first, leading to action, or doing action and that somehow changing hearts.
Yeah.
So if you could comment on either hearts and action, because it seems to be part of your new monastic thing is changing hearts, and then you're clearly into action. I don't know if you can say something about those four choices. Firing up, expanding is one dimension, and the other is hearts and action.
Well, churches and institutions that have been built over decades inevitably have internal conversations that are shaped by a desire for self-preservation. I think we just need to be honest about that. Every church, every judicatory I talk to is interested in renewal or growth or whatever they call it, in part because they don't want to see what they have disappear. And I'm not saying that's bad. I've had very touching conversations with churches that really want to focus on renewal, where someone says, look, I've given my whole life to this place, and this place has given life to me. And I know I'm not going to be around much longer, but when I think about my children, my grandchildren, when I think about people who are younger than me in this community, I want something for them like was here for me. And I think that's a basically good desire. So I certainly affirm that. And I think if an institution is going to adapt and learn what its community needs in the present, it has to be concerned about something more than just self-preservation, right? It has to be focused on this kind of listening that I've been trying to encourage, and a listening that is especially attentive to those who are crying out for justice. So what does that mean for a worship service? I mean, I think there are lots of things happening that in your language are firing people up, that are encouraging people in communities in terms of recognizing the connections between faith and work for justice. I mean, in a city like yours, I would be especially attentive, to the fact that grassroots movement for racial justice, you know, emerged on your streets and echoed across the whole world in the last year. So as you listen to neighbors and friends and maybe congregation members who were part of that, what do you hear people saying that they want? I mean, I've been involved with Black Lives Matter for a long time, and a lot of the people I know in those movements are desperately seeking for a sort of spirituality and daily practice that can sustain them in what they find to be grueling and often depressing work. People who care about systemic change, you know, are often drawn to it because of, you know, desperation. I mean, I can't breathe is not a sort of, you know, long-term strategic plan. It's what people say when they're choking. So what I've found is that there's a real need within that community as you get to know people who are called and genuinely committed to a movement like that, to this basic question of, you know, what keeps me going in this work. I'm not saying that Hennepin even has the answer to that, but I'm saying that if you cultivated a space for people to pursue the answer to that question, it seems to me that a lot of people I know would be interested in that. So I'm just thinking out loud here about the kinds of questions that come from what's happening in the community and how we can respond to those. I have a friend who has, this is an interesting story I was just thinking about the other day. He has planted a church during COVID, and it has never met in person. But he planted this church with people who were listening to folks who were coming home from prison, and with people he knew because he had served as a chaplain at one of our state prisons, people he knew from the prison who were coming home. So he said it was a reentry church. It wasn't going to be a church with a reentry ministry. It was going to be a church for people who are reentering and people who want to, you know, be in fellowship and communion with people who are reentering. And so it's been fascinating for me to just watch, you know, what's happening in that community and what's drawing them together. That's a very different situation because it's a church plant. But, you know, within your own structures, it sounds like you're part of a group that's listening for something new that might be happening. And I think that it's great that the institution recognizes need for creativity. I always just encourage people to, you know, try to think about more than, you know, what might bring people into the building. Think about what are the cries and the genuine needs that people in the community have, and how could you be a space that could welcome that.
I think just the way you said it there, clearly we can just open our eyes and listen with our ears, and we can see the opportunities for justice. And but your comment about the grueling nature of that work is again a statement that, of course, we also have to attend to our faith lives in order to even possibly continue trumping along in this difficult work. So thank you.
Sorry, Mark.
You know, I'm fascinated by the activists I know who want to they want to learn various contemplative practices. It's really interesting. I mean, it makes me think, like, what would and again, you got to figure out the particular forms of it, but like, what would a Tizé service, particularly for, you know, contemplative activists look like? and again, it might not be Taizé because that's a particular tradition from a particular place and time, but I'm saying that style, you know, that like what would a contemplative worship for people who are engaged in activism look like? I think that's the kind of question that our congregations need to be asking.
We've got about 5 minutes and I see 2 hands. And so I'm going to ask you to make this really, really brief. Only because, again, we want to honor your time, but this is exciting because it tells me that that you're engaging. So I'm fabulous. Ginger, I saw your hand, and then David, I saw your hand, and we're right at 4.5 minutes. So Ginger, go ahead.
I wonder about the question that we might ask ourselves, and that would be whether or not by listening you fear that it's and what you feel compelled to do, or what you feel driven, or what you feel led to do would make you feel diminished in some way. Because I sometimes wonder if the lack of taking this step forward is because you don't feel prepared to do the work, or you might feel diminished. It's a tough thing, that fine line between benevolence and loving. That's a tough place to stand.
Thank you. I think that's an important question. Let's just add that into the mix and hear David's question too.
I just wanted to ask Frenchie to explain the month of prayer that occurred on the near north side was that July?
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what that was?
2 of our amazing local activists, Jonathon, who have lived intentionally in a way similar to you, created a prayer tent where people could come and pray silently for 8 minutes and 46 seconds after George Floyd was murdered. And it happened for a full month, brought together lots of different parts and communities of the city around the one quest to pray and find some strength for contemplative action out of that prayer. Don and Sandra Samuels were the leaders of that initiative. So.
And that to me was an example of going into the community, listening to what they want, and doing it.
Believe it or not, it is 11:28. So I'm going to let me just close discussion and say 2 things. Number one, tell all of your friends what they missed today. Number 2, when you tell them what they missed, remind them that Jonathon is our guest preacher tomorrow for both services at 8:30 and 10 o'clock. And so you'll have an opportunity to hear not just his work as a scholar and as a writer and as a thinker, but you'll actually have a chance to hear him as a preacher. And it's not something they don't want to miss that. And then can I simply ask us to, in a wonderful way of Hennepin hospitality, to show our appreciation and our thanks for all that you have given us today, Jonathon. We are truly grateful. And then also, if I'm going to take a point of personal privilege and say that Jonathon turned 40. He just had his 40th birthday, and he ran and trained for a half marathon. So happy 40th birthday.
Oh, thank you.
May you continue with this amazing revolution of values, and God's blessing on your work. And we hope to have you at Hennepin sometime in the future in person.
In the flesh, it'd be a joy. It would be a joy.
In the flesh. Thank you so much for coming. Again, this is the first of many of these Hennepin Hope conversations that we are really aching to have. If you know someone who would be a wonderful person to bring to our community, please don't hesitate to send me an email, and you will receive in the next few days an invitation to give your feedback and assessment of our time today. But thank you so much. Blessings on the rest of your day. It's 11:30. Grace and peace, my friends. Go well.